Starting now. Okay, I think we are live on air. And to anyone listening, welcome to the first ever and episode 1. And this is the introductory podcast, not just for the year, but for all time. So you're very lucky to be listening to this first ever podcast from us. So my name is James Began. I'm a member of Men's Voices Ireland. And today I'm talking with David Walsh, who is the chairman and founder of the group, and Sarah Gray, who is a new addition to the group. Well, we're basically just going to talk about some issues that we've read about and that we're interested in talking about, and we're also going to talk about the group itself, who we are, what we do, and why we do it. So, hello.
Hello, are you saying hello to us?
I'm saying hello to you.
Hello.
Okay.
We're gonna do a little bit of a round. So, Sarah, you're one of the newer people in the group. We met you at the conference last year in November.
Yeah.
Yep. And you've kind of opted to come along to this podcast and give up your time.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for that. So why are you? Well, I suppose I could say, why are we talking about these issues? Why are we talking about men's issues on a podcast at 2:00 on a Saturday when we could be doing anything else?
For me, it's because I think I can see a kind of a perspective that needs to be looked at more, and that a lot of people are kind of ignoring or just have no idea it's there at all. And that's that there's a bit of an imbalance going on in society, and that women seem to be the receivers of all things good and protected at all times. And it's kind of forgetting that, like, men are people too, and they need support and protection too. And just that the way things are going, if nothing changes, I don't know what's in store, but I don't think it can keep going this way, because it's really unbalanced, and I'd like to see everybody happy, not just one gender or the other.
Wow, that's very well put.
Thank you.
And I did do ladies first. There's a little bit of chivalry here.
Thank you.
A lot of people might think we're a bunch of nasty people and so on, but we're not above that.
Thank you.
At least not for podcasts. So David,
For always.
For always, yeah. David, you basically introduced me to the group. Well, I met you through Derek Murphy, who's not here, but you're the chairman and you're the founder of this group, and you spend a lot of your time and money on it and effort, as we can see here. So I suppose, why? For people listening and thinking, what's this all about? Why do we need this group in 2017?
Okay. First, I'll say a little about my own involvement in men's issues. I've been looking at these issues for a good many years. It started first, I think, with the suicide issue, and I began to pick up on this many years ago, 25 years ago or so. Began to see how the suicide rates from men were so high, and I was wondering about it for why this was so, and I was struck by the fact that almost nobody was talking about it, and then later I began to pick up on other issues about men, and the second issue was concerning how men were dealt with in the family court system, and again I began to realize that men were actually treated very unfairly by the family court system, and they came out financially very badly off. They came out having lost their home, perhaps, and they came out also with problems of having access to children. And along with all of this, I began to pick up also on a very negative attitude towards men in society. Men were seen as somehow negative, in a negative light. They were seen as being somehow responsible for all the problems in society. And this was reflected in the media. it is reflected in the legislation as well, in the way that men were treated, first of all, by the family court system, but also in the way that the issues regarding men, the way they were suffering in terms of health and other issues. They were deprived of access to their children in many cases when relationships broke down. And there was absolutely no heed paid to these issues, these problems. And so that was how it started with me, and began to build up in that way until very recently when a few of us decided to do something about it. But I can leave it there for the moment, James, if you want
Yeah,
to.
no, that's very good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people will have the same, you're two very different people, obviously, but your basic approach was very similar. Like there's nothing being said about this. And my own arrival in the group is very similar as well. I actually, before I was involved with the group, I somehow managed to wrangle a position as a writer at my university's newspaper. And it was largely because of, just watching how some of the attitudes towards, especially young men, men my age, I'm 25, so maybe a little bit younger than me, actually, maybe between the age 18 to 25, were being hammered constantly for being, basically just horrible people, responsible for all the ills in the world, holding on to all their privilege, etc., etc. And at the same time, you see, well, that's not entirely true. There's a lot of guys who are, I knew personally, and who I later learned from my own research, being cut out of their children's lives, whether they're married or not. And a number of health issues and risks, male suicide, problems with male mental health, and attitudes in general towards, just men as a group. So then I kind of got involved with the group through Derek Murphy, who I kind of collaborated with to write an article about male suicide. And from there, I was just involved from then on. So why? I suppose it would be, the fundamental reason why I would do this would be because I don't like the way this is going. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, something has to change. Like,
exactly. Like, I don't like to just personally, I don't like opening up, some news opinion article or whatever every week about how terrible I am. But also, there's a lot of injustices that are being done, and problems that are being created by the lack of attention being paid to these issues. So that's basically why, in a nutshell. But then the next question after why we do it personally is why this group? What are we actually trying to do? Are we just going to get together and have a wine every week or two?
No.
Or are we going to try and actually do things about it? Because a lot of the people who are actually talking about these issues are, in my opinion, they're just venting on social media or equivalent. And that's not going to get anything done. It's in fact going to just turn people off what you're doing.
Yeah.
So, David, I suppose, what would be the main activity that, other than talking to each other, which is obviously a big part of being in a group, what is Men's Voices Ireland's sort of plan of action or modus operandi?
Yeah. First of all, I'd like to say something about the beginnings of the group, because I think it's important to focus on just the sort of helplessness that a lot of people feel, especially men in today's world. And we felt the same. A number of us that started to meet regularly back in around 2014. One of them was Derek Murphy, who is well known to you, of course, and Andy is another. But we began to meet to discuss these matters, and we felt a helplessness because we felt that the media were against us. We felt that politicians didn't want to know about these issues. They had been neglected for so long. We knew that certain journalists had been writing about these issues. For instance, John Waters had been writing about suicide in the Irish Times. He'd also been writing about family law because he was directly affected by it. He'd been writing in columns for more than 20 years. And yet he was a lone voice, or almost a lone voice. And there was almost no heed being paid to it. In fact, sometimes a lot of people simply scoffed at it and said, oh, there's that guy again. He's over the top. He's always like that. He used to appear on TV programs from time to time, and he would get a hearing there and then. But it never seemed to strike home to people that there were serious issues here that needed to be tackled, and this is the situation, and we took up on that issue, and we felt the same helplessness. We felt, gosh, if somebody like that has been hammering away at this for the last 20 years, without any improvements being made, how can anything happen? And we were meeting and we were just simply talking about it. We were talking simply in order to alleviate our own misgivings and probably to simply talk it out of our systems. But we wanted to share our experiences and our insights, to speak about the neglect and what could be done about it. And then we decided it was time to do something. Rather than simply talk. So, I think it was in 2015. I set up a conference in Maynooth, and we invited a number of people. We didn't know who to invite. Dark had some names. He had the names of people in men's groups. He had a lot of liaison with men's groups. So we sent out invitations to people that we thought might be interested. And so we met in Maynooth. This is towards the end of 2015, and we had this meeting. Now, I should say that this meeting was probably sparked off by the fact that the government signed the Istanbul Convention in November 2015.
Yeah.
And that was really a kind of a challenge, that sort of was a summons to action of some kind.
For people listening, just sorry to interrupt you, David, the Istanbul Convention would probably merit a series of podcasts to discuss the problems with it. But if you're not familiar with what it is, what it basically would be is a cross-European strategy for approaching domestic violence as an issue. And to put it in really simple terms, it is positing that domestic violence is a male on female problem and should always be looked at that way by all the states who signed up for it, including us. So that's kind of a very simplistic way of putting it, but we would need a full podcast or two just to go through it. Okay, sorry, David.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so as I said, that was a kind of a summons to action. So we had this meeting in Maynooth, and it was a very small number of people that showed up, but at least it had the effect of galvanizing us into some kind of action, and making us try to think out some plan of action of how to proceed. So we did begin to think about how we might proceed. Incidentally, I should say that, before going further, that one of the main sources of helplessness that men feel is the fact there are no male advocacy groups in the country.
Yeah.
At least no male advocacy groups set up with a broad remit. There are certain groups who work on certain single issues, but there is no male advocacy group which works with a broad remit across the board, looking at men's issues, because these issues are connected. These issues are connected. The suicide is connected with other issues. The suicide rate is connected with other issues. It's connected, we believe, with the outcomes in the family court system, and with still other issues as well, and with the general neglect. And the lack of any male advocacy group is a fundamental sign of that neglect, because it's I mean, it's striking that men don't have an advocacy group. You can think of advocacy groups for even the very small minority groups, but you can't think of an advocacy group for men.
Yeah, I
And
suppose most of the advocacy groups for men it wouldn't be for men as men. It would be if you're a man who falls into a particular category of minority, it's your identity as that minority that
rather
is
than,
being examined. It's not, just being a man. That's considered, completely not needing any addressing at all, right?
that's right. That's right. Yes, there are no there's no advocacy group on a national basis with a broad remit acting for men, because it's seen that men are privileged class. This is the attitude of a great deal of media, a great deal of establishment thinking, and this is one of the fundamental causes of helplessness that I spoke about earlier. We just didn't have a group that we could act through, and that we could push our voices through. And so anyway, arising out of that meeting in Maynooth, we decided that what we would do would be to take advantage of the fact that an election was coming up in 2016, in early 2016.
Yep.
And we decided that it would be a good launch for a group. And what we could do is we could, in a sense, make it political, because we could write to all the election candidates and say, these are the issues facing men, or at least some of them, and ask them, what do you think of these issues? Do you think that these issues are worthy of attention? Do you think these issues are urgent? And asking them, a second question was, what would you do about these issues if you were elected? So
Yeah.
that was what happened at that time. So we got I think we got 58 responses from 58 candidates across the parties, and 13 of these were elected. Now, it turned out that 2 or 3 of these TDs actually have helped us in the meantime. They did actually not just respond positively, but they did give positive help in a couple of ways along the way. So we can talk about that later. But that was one of the outcomes of that particular campaign. So then after that, we, at the same time, of course, we set up a website for Men's Voices.
Yep.
And we determined that we would continue using the name Men's Voices Ireland to continue on the work which we had started during the election. We would continue talking to politicians. We would continue making submissions to interested agencies, state agencies, and we would continue talking to the media to bring our views before the public. And so that's kind of a summary of how we started. I should say before going further with that, that I should mention that we drew up a list of 6 what we see key issues that we saw as key areas which were urgent and demanded immediate attention, and those were domestic violence against men and the Istanbul Convention. Second one, male suicide. Third was boys failing in education, an issue that never gets any attention. The fourth was family law injustices. The fifth was homelessness, which affects men to a very great degree. And sixth was false allegations of child abuse and rape. So those were the issues.
These are the 6 key issues that we have on our website if you want to check it out, which is
right.
mensvoicesireland.com, right? And there's an in-depth discussion of, well, pretty much all of them on the website. And if you were to peruse that information, you could also find some nice references if you wanted to find out more about them. And I think we'll probably use this podcast as an outlet to sort of explore those issues as well. We have plans to do that, and also to perhaps have some non-Men's Voices Ireland people on, guests, possibly even debate with people who have a different perspective. So that's on the cards for the future in 2017. Now that you've explained, David, thank you for explaining where the group came from. I suppose, again, we make a lot of submissions to things like various committees involved in the DAL, who are often involved in the actual process that leads up to policy. And one of the problems really is that there has been an absence of such a group for men. And as a result, it's not really a consideration in policy, sort of what it's done to deal with various issues. Would that be a correct way of looking at it?
Exactly. That's exactly correct, James. And when we got the opportunity to make a presentation in Leinster House in June of 2016, this was one of the points that we tried to hammer home. The fact that there is no male advocacy group which would represent men in front of DAL committees. DAL committees or Oireachtas committees, I should say, which deal with social policy issues which are of concern to people across the board, and men in particular. Committees dealing with such topics as the Justice Committee deals with topics as family law and domestic violence. There's a Health Committee which deals with health issues. There's an Education Committee, and there are a number of others. And there is absolutely no representation before these committees on issues of vital concern to men. And this became absolutely crystal clear back in February 2014, when the Justice Committee held hearings on the issue of domestic violence. And on that occasion, there was a whole phalanx of groups on one side calling for measures on domestic violence for their particular agenda. But on the side of men, there was nothing. It was absolutely astounding. It was shocking, in fact, to find that there was no group to argue on behalf of men and the male side, how men viewed the whole domestic violence issue. And this, more than anything else, I think brought home to me how vital it is to have a male advocacy group in existence.
Absolutely. So I would say, getting involved in the political level would be when people ask, oh, so what do you guys even do? Are you just a bunch of moaners? I would say no, that would be the sort of activist wing of the group. We made submissions and met with IREC, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Committee. We've met with TDs, I think both as a group and as individual members.
Correct.
But in addition to that, I think we're also looking to sort of be a bit of a cultural force, because a lot of this stuff stems from the culture, right? In my opinion, it is downstream from it. So, politicians just respond to what people seem to want or seem to talk about. And if there's no pressure, there's no cultural around this, then what's the incentive if you're a politician looking for votes, or even just looking to pass policy? If you've never even heard this perspective before, why would you care?
Right.
And especially, not only do you not hear that perspective, but you hear, in fact, other perspectives which are usually ideological, saying the precise opposite of what we're saying. So when we say there are issues that are really important, that are men's issues, or issues that affect men disproportionately, and their gender issues, there'll be 10, 20 other people saying that, there are no problems for men. They are just, everything's fine for them, and we need to focus on, anyone else but them. That's something you've noticed in the culture, Sarah.
Sorry, I am still here. I'm just listening because obviously I've only been around for the last few weeks, so I'm listening and learning as opposed to talking about not knowing anything. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like, representation in like looking for favors from those in power in the shape of requests from representational groups has always been for minorities that might have been forgotten about or been, you know, put in second place. Like, you know what I mean? Like, no one's ever thought of representing the apparently powerful, power holding majority. I guess it's an alien concept to lots of people, and it might take a fair bit of kind of context and grounding and patience and kind of repetition to get across to people that men as a group are deserving and needing representation too, because people would say, oh, you know, disabled, we need the voice of the disabled, and we need a voice of those in mental health difficulty, and we need a voice of, you know, ethnic minorities, and we need a voice for minority religions. No, everybody needs a voice. And I guess it's just because for so long the world has thought that men have all the power. So why on earth would they need a voice to them, to their own power holding selves? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I do know what you mean. And I think if someone listening to this is maybe a little bit unsympathetic or unfamiliar even, they might be yelling at their screen or whatever they're doing about how, oh, what do you mean you have all the power? And they'll have statistics for like number of TDs or number of CEOs or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Just to point out, like, just because, for example, just because there's a majority of male TDs, that does not mean that they will deal with men's issues.
No.
And if you want evidence for that, just look at how little of these are issues are actually of concern to, or not even of concern, but how many of them are actually at the forefront. So how often do you hear about the really important policy that's going to be implemented to try and tackle male suicide specifically? There isn't one. If you want to look at any issue that we would bring up on our website or anything that David mentioned earlier, there's not actually very much being done in the way of looking at it from a gendered perspective. When someone says a gender issue, it's usually a code way of saying a women's issue.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Gender studies and women's studies are basically interchangeable terms.
Yeah.
Which is kind of insane when you actually think about it. But that's the way it typically is. And I would just say it's really important to recognize that being in power, as in a man being in a position of power, does not necessarily mean that he will make efforts to specifically benefit or deal with men's issues. And the evidence for that is before you, if you look at the track record of successive governments on these issues.
Yeah, I mean, the whole, you know, people say it's white men are the lords and masters of the world.
Yeah, of course.
It's just so oversimplifying things. So
indeed, it is. I mean, it kind of just comes from sort of Marxist thinking, really. You just replace the bourgeois class with male, and the proletariat with, well, anyone else but that. You can add in race as well, and sexual orientation if you want, depending on where you're coming from. And that's what justifies this lack of attention. But anyway, I don't want to get too sort of whiny, because that's not really what we're about. I mean, occasionally when we meet in person, and we do meet from time to time every few weeks around Dublin, usually to chat about these things and to make plans, usually spend at least a few minutes kind of going, oh my God, I can't believe I read this article or saw this and got this response from this person I emailed or whatever. I'm not going to name any names. But then we really do get into, you know, what are we trying to do? And just as a review of 2016, David, you've already mentioned that we gave presentations in Leinster House. I mentioned some of the presentations we gave to various committees and organizations. We also had our inaugural conference in November.
That's right,
that was a huge success.
That was a good success, yeah. It was, yes.
Yeah, it was. And you gotta love the word inaugural.
Yeah, it sounds very posh and fancy, but really what we had was a conference in Wynn's Hotel in Dublin, and it was basically a day of speeches and dialogue between the speakers and the audience, and group discussion of various issues. We had a good turnout, and we had some really great speakers who talked about various issues, talked about male mental health, male suicide, family court system, and well, a whole variety of issues really. And at the moment, we are actually working on getting the conference footage. We took good recordings of everything. It's going to go up onto this YouTube channel for you to watch. And we're going to be starting to paste some choice clips from those speeches as well on our social media. So you can look out for that as well.
Sure.
Now,
And
yeah.
Yeah,
Go ahead, David.
and
Sorry.
we're going to follow on from the conference, James. Yeah. Following on from the conference, we're continuing to lobby politicians. Only last week we met 2 members of the Justice Committee, and we spoke about the Istanbul Convention, and we really brought home to them what we consider to be the injustice of this document.
Yeah.
And we are continuing to seek to meet other members. It's a very slow progress, I can tell you. You mentioned politicians, apathy of politicians earlier. Politicians are watching every issue now, and in particular, they don't want to be seen to be crossing any major lobby group. And at the moment, Men's Voices is not a particularly strong lobby group.
No.
So we have a difficult job ahead of us in trying to establish ourselves as a group with a voice and with serious things to say about these matters, and as a group needing to be taken in consideration. We do want to start debate about these issues. So as well as talking to politicians, we're also talking to journalists. So in the last few weeks as well, since January, in fact, since New Year, we've been talking to the journalists and attempting to make the case for some of the issues that we spoke about earlier. The most striking and urgent ones, of course, are domestic violence and the Istanbul Convention, because these issues are coming before the Dáil shortly, but
Yes.
also on other issues, on education, for instance, and on health as well. We actually asked to be put on what's known as the Policy Advisory Group for the National Men's Health Policy.
Yes.
And again,
There's
that is
what
another
policy?
issue.
Sorry.
There is a National Men's Health Policy,
Oh, very good.
Sarah.
There is, there has been one for, I think, since 2008. That was the last one, but I don't think most of the recommendations within it were ever actually really addressed. I'm sure Derek, if he's listening, would know exactly what was and wasn't implemented, because that's his field of study. He's a psychologist, and perhaps Dr. Tim Dunn as well, another person we know who's a psychologist, and spoke at our conference. But as far as I'm aware, I've read the policy myself. I think it was 2008 to 2013, and then it lapsed in 2015 at the latest.
That's correct.
Essentially, it did contain some good perspectives that would be, I think we would support, but I do not think much attention was actually paid to it. We probably could, again, do an entire podcast talking about the problems around their approach to mental health issues when it comes to men. But that's not really the time now, really. We're just trying to introduce ourselves, introduce the group, and let's just be honest, make sure that we can technically get this thing out there.
Yeah.
And before we start making real plans. I think it's working. I think it's going pretty well so far. We had no major technical issues with the audio or internet connections, so that's good.
Good.
Yeah, it's really good. Now, I have here as a rough guideline that we were going to talk about some maybe current events, but I think you just mentioned, David, that you've been meeting with the people in the Justice Committee and are looking towards having us have a voice in, I suppose it's the Istanbul Convention, in particular, domestic violence issue.
That's right.
But before I go on, I should just clarify to people who are listening that Men's Voices Ireland is not, if you like, funded group. We are basically a volunteer group, quite an eclectic mix of people who just feel strongly about these issues, and we just basically give up some of our free time to be involved. We're not a powerful lobby group, if you like, in the same way that certain other voices are at the moment in the Dáil, and indeed just under the government aegis in general. There is no such group to my knowledge that is, although there are some groups that are on specific issues that do get government funding. And that's really the issue. It's not an area that you can go into and expect to be funded if you're politically active, as we are, whereas in other cases it actually is. So you can expect to be funded to lobby on behalf of certain minority groups or whatever it may be. But I think for men's groups, the only real avenue to funding is if you are a support group of some sort.
Yes,
In which case, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, Sarah, what did you say?
No, in which case you could expect to get funding from who?
Well, there are it's government funding. For
But
example,
like what
Amen.
departments, like health or?
I'm not sure which department Amen is funded from. Amen is the domestic violence charity that deals with male victims. They are not politically lobbying in any way. They are a support group based in Meath. They have one office in Meath. But the point is, if you were to be what we are, which would be, there are people involved with us who definitely have been in support groups in the past and men's groups for years, but the entity of Men's Voices Ireland doing, what we're doing now, trying to engage with political process and affect policy, you will not get funding for it.
That's correct. Yes, that's a major drawback for us. We simply don't have any funding. We don't have prospect of getting funding from the state, and it really hampers our activities because so much depends, even at a very basic level, so much depends on having an office. For instance, the basic requirement of having an office with somebody who is there to take phone calls or to answer emails, to liaise with other groups or to pick up on articles which might be of interest to men and who have impact on men's policies, on male issues, and such like, and even somebody to do research. We simply don't have the means to do any of these things.
A good idea shouldn't cost money to spread, though. If you think about, like, if you really get simple and kind of naive and old-fashioned like I am about it, you know what I mean? To spread a good idea should just take faith and enthusiasm. I mean, okay, it could take a lot of time for someone to do research, but if enough people care about something and care enough to designate duties and be organized and disciplined in their approach to those duties, then a good idea should not need money at all. I'm just saying,
Oh yeah, well look, we actually have done quite a bit considering we're entirely part-time amateurs essentially. We did manage to get the conference, and we did manage to get quite a few nice things out of 2016. We had an op-ed in the journal.ie. We had a small appearance on, oh God, I've forgotten his name.
Brendan O'Connor,
that's the one. Which both of which boosted our profile a good little bit in the media, and of course all that was quote unquote free, except for a lot of the costs of things like not necessarily monetary costs, but the fact that you're never going to have the same level of impact when you're coming out of a day job and then putting in a bit of time as you would if you could dedicate yourself to it. And the fact is that there are a lot of essentially professional lobbyists and professional activists who do get funded, who have slick, well-heeled campaigns, who have sympathetic ears in the media, and who control the narrative, as it were. And that's what we're basically up against. A lot of these people are, if not apathetic, actively hostile to some of the things that we would actually say. And that sounds like some kind of a conspiracy theory. It really isn't. Like, you can just go read some of the contributors to the mainstream publications, even in this country. It's absolutely insane, in my opinion, in the UK and in the US. It's beyond the pale there, but it's still pretty bad here as well. And you'll see just how the culture isn't really, I think things are getting better, but it isn't really quite there with regards to being sympathetic towards men's issues as being a real problem that we should be worried about.
Well, no, it's not. And that's why this needs to be talked about and this needs to grow, because it's the least fashionable cause in the world right now. It's the cause of the perceived power holders. Like, so
yes, of course.
So no one's going to fund you, and no one that's going to, no, it's not even safe for like probably well-known people or big companies to put their names behind this until they can understand fully the way we understand it. Do you know what I mean? It sounds like a really dangerous point to make in the wrong room at the wrong time. Do you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've had quite a lot of people react in, not necessarily a negative, but either a slightly negative to kind of confused way, because, you know, they have a perception of who I would be as a person, and then it just doesn't seem to add up, probably because they're reading about how people who are active in this area are whatever, misogynists, Nazis, you know, you name it. It's been thrown at the people involved in the men's movement. Even, you know, Dr. Warren Farrell, if anyone listening to this doesn't know who that is.
I don't know who that is.
Yes, Dr. Warren Farrell is one of the sort of, I know, the vanguard of the men's movement. And before that, he was the vanguard of the women's movement. He was on the National Organization for Women board in New York, I think 3 times in a row.
Really?
And he basically was character assassinated and sort of tossed out of the movement, if you like, because he started to say things like shared parenting is more important than this model we have where it's presumed that you're going to have if there's a divorce, for example, dad's going to go work and pay for everything and mom's going to keep the kids in the house. For daring to say, hey, maybe it should be shared 50-50 responsibilities, you know, things like that. He was well, you can see videos of him giving a talk, I think, in Quebec, and just the vitriol and the immense security they had to have for this guy who's just a soft-spoken, very polite man who just has a few points to make about these issues, basically.
How long ago was that?
Oh, his work has been going on for at least 3 decades, if not more. But specifically the vitriol and so on has been in the last 10 years or so. I can perhaps dig up some videos of him talking about it and put it in the description of the video of this when it goes up. But yeah, Dr. Warren Farrell is someone whose books and whose writings I consumed quite a bit when I started to get involved in this. And basically, he's not saying much different what we're saying about sort of issues that are important, but he kind of writes more from the point of view of understanding and cooperation between the genders, or I should say between the sexes now. Like, he has a book that's actually written for women called Why Men Are the Way They Are. So that was written about, I can't remember when it was written, but it was written as sort of a explainer, if you like. It might be kind of quaint now in the current age to read it, but a lot of it is very true and very sensible and can be applied to a lot, not every single man, obviously, but a lot of men. to explain how they think and why their perspective being ignored is or not considered valid is a problem. But anyway, I think we're rambling now a little bit.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I don't want it to be too long.
Right.
So maybe I could move on and say if any of you have any particular current media developments, legal, political developments that are kind of relevant to, I guess, men's issues, we'd like to talk about them. We could have a little chat and then wrap it up.
Yep.
So Sarah, would you like to go first, or?
I'm afraid of coming across as too strong in my opinions, except on one little thing, which is I have these cards in my house that I got in a charity shop, and they're just like, it's like a pack of cards about writing and the art of writing.
Okay.
And I just, every week or so, I just change which one's on display. I don't write much, but it's nice to see them around. I like quotes, you know?
Yeah.
And this week's one is by, I don't know where he's from, Oi Kenzaburo, born in 1935, from his work Art and Healing, or her work Art and Healing. And it says, literature must be written from the periphery towards the center. The man who is in the center does not have anything to write. And that struck me just from the point of view that I think women benefit a lot more from each other's inclusion in a kind of almost every aspect of their lives, with the result that men are more often the outsiders in society. In an individual sense, you know, hence the kind of male suicide statistics and stuff. Men can get left out easier. Women will share experiences, will share distress, will share joy, will share trivia much more, I think, than men do. So it just, in relation to the kind of the big controversy last year about the theatre in the Abbey for 1916 and stuff, and how there wasn't enough women's work represented.
Okay.
That quote said to me that maybe it's worth thinking that, is it possible that more male playwrights in this context could have more valuable work from a point of view of they are outsiders writing about society, rather than the man who is in the center, which is women, who have less of an outsider perspective because they're rarely outsiders. Do you know what I mean? So anyway,
I'm not sure.
You might want to edit it all that, cut all that out, because it might not have made any sense. David, did you understand what I said?
Some of it, a good deal of it, but not all of it, Sarah.
I think there's a point to giving value to the argument that it's possible that, you know, male theatre playwrights in this example could have been justifiably making up the majority in the program, you know, because possibly they have more often an outsider's perspective, whereas a writer who has no outsider perspective in them, who's never been an outsider in their lives, hasn't really got much to say that will catch the interest of a theatre going public, you know? We
really need Andy here to talk about this. Andy is a published author, playwright, and director, and everything, and acting coach. He's literally the perfect man to talk about this.
Sure, but I just because it fits with the mental health thing, you know, like people who suffer, get depressed, get excluded, end up in that awful suicide ideology corner of life. It's exclusion by their own making sometimes, and by society's making, that can get them there. To be included, to be at the center, is one of the things that women have and don't even realize they have. You know, they are the community, they are the home, they are.
Oh yeah.
They're the center, you know. So it just, I don't know. It kind of it leaves me stuck for words. How simple it seems to me, you know, that this is something that women really don't count on their list of assets when they're looking at all the assets they think men have that they don't have, you know, is this power of communing and sharing.
Yeah, this is, I'm actually at the moment I'm working on, well, I say working on, I'm just doing a bit of research right now. I'm working on an article about the sort of the boy crisis in education, and the kind of one of the issues that we have on our website about men in education. And one of the things that's always struck me as very, maybe it's a strange oversight, but maybe it's just a perspective. What you just said there about women not necessarily realizing what assets they do have because they're so focused on what men appear to have.
Yeah.
You talk about power, we're always hearing about power and men have all the power. I don't think there's anything more powerful for society than controlling the rearing of children and the socialization of children at a young age. And those are two areas that are still overwhelmingly female dominated. Now that is changing somewhat. I suppose there's a lot more of a push for shared parenting and groups wanting that, and men wanting to be involved in their children's lives at a young age, and paternity leave coming in and all that kind of stuff. But nonetheless, that power is very real.
Yeah, and no man can force himself into that process from day one. You know, a child is born to a mother, is physically dependent on that mother. You know, so women they're shaping every individual in the world as that individual comes into the world. And that's influence in its purest form, and people don't give that any kind of weight as a type of power, but it's the biggest there is. Like,
yeah, I've gotten in trouble a few times for saying, well, you know, you read these pieces saying you young men are so terrible and awful and misogynistic, and say, okay, so they're born. If they're born in a single home, there's about a 90% chance they're being reared by a mother. If not, they're probably going to be reared more by their mother at a young age anyway. And they're going to schools where there's almost all female teachers for a decade and a half. And then they're coming out the other end as horrible misogynists and so on. Well, what are you doing? What's going on, women? You know, I'm being a bit facetious, but there's a lot of power there that is.
It's a good point, Jen.
I think it is.
I think it's a fair point. Hello?
Yeah, maybe not a true point. I think it's more of an attack on the perception of the demonization of young men, because if I were the one with the majority of influence over their development and this was happening, I think I'd feel ashamed of myself first. Do you know what I mean? If I was pointing at some 16-year-old or something and saying how terrible he was or how terrible he was going to become, I would feel responsible if I were the one, the class of people, if you like. If we're going to divide people up into classes, I would feel a deep sense of personal guilt first before I would point the finger at them. And yeah, I don't know, it's just a thought, a bit of a rambly thought.
But then could you say that, I don't know, I'm just going on instinct, that young people, for as long as the human race has existed, have been inclined to be influenced by the females in their gathering, in their herd, in their team, in their tribe, in their village, because for hundreds of thousands of years the women were the people that were around. So having female teachers all through primary and secondary school is kind of normal, because maybe for all those years before we were this type of civilization, it was the women who were teaching the kids and young people, because the men were out looking for food.
I'm not so sure about that. I mean, in terms of teaching, the number of male teachers at all levels has declined in the last 30 years quite a lot. And if you look, you know, pre-industrialization, you would have had, you know, home industry, farming, you know, you're working all day with your parents together. And then you look at all these like initiation rituals and tribal rituals and things like that seem really weird to us today, but which were usually at young men to socialize them essentially into being part of the tribe, if you like. These kind of things. I actually think that female primary school teachers are to blame for whatever problems.
Misogyny. No,
of course not. I'm just kind of pointing out the absurdity of ignoring that kind of power, and then if you do want to point the finger, not asking if the people who are most involved in socialization, if they have a role in it. That's all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like, sorry, go on in there, David.
Just one thing, harking back to something that Sarah said earlier, that women have this capacity to talk about their problems more than men do, right?
Mm.
In relation to that, Stoicism has been a philosophy which has been strong throughout the world, the Western world, for millennia, really. It's this idea, that their life is difficult, doesn't do to complain all the time about your problems. People have enough to on their own plate rather than listening internally to other people's problems. So probably men have been imbued with this stoicism for a long time, and it's not a bad thing, because it does fortify people. This idea, you face adversity and you take it on and you don't complain. It helps people to keep going. But there are times when it is good to talk, sure. And I think Tim Dunn, in his talk at the conference, actually spoke about that it's good to talk at times, but it's not always good to talk either. He actually made the point that there are times when it's best not to talk about your problems. And so it brings up an interesting kind of dichotomy there, which probably is food for thought for another time.
Well, yeah, I think it reflects again the lack of this perspective. I mean, so often it goes unchallenged. You read things like men don't know how to show emotion, they're being stultified. And it's just not true. There's a difference between emotional mastery and being a mess who's unable to feel anything. I mean, that's just not a characterization of what any men are. Even those who might, sort of, there are plenty of sort of male, I'm going to say male feminists. It's probably a little bit of a stretch in some sense, but a lot of those people ideology and say, oh, I don't feel I'm allowed to cry, or I'm a big wuss. I really think that's overstated as a cause for these problems. That if only that men could be more like women, basically what they're saying.
That's it.
That's not true. I mean, first of all, men aren't women. We're different beings. That's actually sadly somewhat controversial to say these days, but it's true. And just telling them to be like something they aren't does not, to me, seem to be a very good recipe for fixing any of the problems. And also that conveniently absolves people in positions of power from having to actually do anything, because what it basically does is reiterates the same problem of sort of traditionalists saying you need to man up. They're basically doing the same thing, except they're saying you need to sort it out yourself, but by doing it this way, which I think will work. As long as I don't have to do anything, it's fine. That's basically what it is. And it's actually hilarious how they're espousing the exact ideology they're claiming to be against. Because I would say, hey, well, how about you fund this study into, men's groups, or give this funding to this organization, things like the Men's Sheds Initiative and all that. No, it's just that men are, they're brainwashed into becoming macho automatons, and once we break down those that social construct, then everything will be fine. It's actually remarkably facile analysis as well. Really lazy, and it passes for sophisticated because it's all you see in most of the mainstream media about this. But anyway, that's just my off the cuff take on it. David, do you have any current events or piece of media that you would like to respond to or bring up?
Well, something that struck me in the last couple of weeks was the consent question came up again in the media.
Oh, of course, yeah.
It came up in response to, I think, a statement probably from the Minister for Justice that she was going to bring in a definition of consent into the new criminal law and sexual offences bill. And just what a definition of consent will do to improve situations is simply a mystery to me. I don't know how it's going to help anything. You know, I just don't see that it is going to help anything, because at the end of the day, you know, if it's still going to be an argument between two people. If one brings a charge against the other, the question is still going to arise: did you consent? And one person might say, yes, you did consent, and the other person say, no, I didn't.
And maybe just for the benefit of the listeners, we should probably explain just a little bit what we're actually talking about in terms of what actually has happened. Would you like to do that, David, or do you want me to do it?
You go ahead and do it, Jim.
Well, basically, up until this point, recently, under the current government, the only definition of consent, to my knowledge, was established in the legal definition was not spoken about by the Oireachtas. It was only by the courts. And there are, of course, offences for rape and sexual assault, which basically said that a perpetrator is a perpetrator if he. I think one definition of rape is male and female only, and there's another one which can be any sex or gender on any other. But basically, you have to either not have obtained consent or be reckless as to their consent, and that would have been interpreted in the courts throughout the years. But now there's actually going to be a legal definition put forth from the Department of Justice and Equality, which includes a number of, well, fairly obvious things in it, like if someone is unconscious, for example, they couldn't consent.
Or they've been drugged.
Asleep, if they've been drugged, if they have been unlawfully detained. All of these things, which to me is perfectly sensible. I'm sure we'd all agree. Do we all agree?
Well, yeah, if a person is asleep or if they're intoxicated and they're out for the count.
Of course.
Or they're like, what is it again? Unlawfully detained. So like if they're tied up or unable to escape, like those, yes, I agree. Those three things make sense. But other than that, are you not asking the courts to define yes and to define no? I mean, aren't they two words that we learn as children? Nobody needs to tell me what yes means to me or what no means to me. I know. Do you know what I mean? It just seems it seems like I read an article about that Francis Fitzgerald thing during the week, and by the end of it, I had obtained absolutely nothing. It just, it was like a glass of absolute, not even a glass of water. It was like an empty glass. Nothing. I took nothing from, do you know what I mean? I took nothing out of it. I was like, nothing came into my head there. What difference does it make if the courts define consent, yes or no? It's not going to make any difference. Like, if people are not able to say yes or no because they're tied up or because they're asleep or because they're unconscious, obviously there's a crime being committed there if someone is having their way with them. But otherwise, you're never gonna know what happened in that situation. It's gonna be two people arguing against each other.
Well, David, what do you think? I actually have quite a bit to say about this one because I've written quite a lot about this issue myself in my own personal capacity. But what were your thoughts about it, particularly?
Yeah, in the first place, this issue of consent is being presented as being gender neutral, like a whole lot of other issues, James. Around domestic violence as well. But they're anything but gender neutral. Because, for instance, as you said a moment ago, in relation to consent, a man can be found guilty of raping a woman, but a woman cannot be found guilty of raping a man, at least when it comes to intercourse.
You mean forced to penetrate, just to clarify?
If a woman forces a man to have sex, that is not rape, under our law. and this is a major anomaly, because therefore it means that the issue is skewed from the start. So the issue about consent is directed against men. But on the other issue of consent, what it seems to be driving at is you must ask if you want sex, you must ask for permission, and it must be verbal. That's the way it seems to me, and of course, an awful lot of sexual messages are conveyed without non-verbally. I mean,
absolutely. I mean, this
most
is just
of them. Most communication is non-verbal. You know, it's by sign, by a smile, by a look. You know, you don't have to say these things. So I don't know what this verbal definition is going to achieve in that sense. And finally, I come back again to what I said a little while ago, and that is that even if consent was asked, and if one person says, I did ask for consent, and the other person says, no, you didn't, and I didn't give it, who is going to decide?
Exactly. So what's the point in the courts making a definition of something they can't, or nobody can prove?
If you look at what there is being a push for across the pond in the US, now, of course, that's a wholly different jurisdiction to us, but things have a nasty habit. If you look through social movements, they have a nasty habit of spreading across, usually to our neighbors in the UK and then perhaps to us. The affirmative consent sort of definition was an attempt to increase the number of basically prosecutions. And the idea was that rather than having to, it's active in universities, I believe in California, but it has not been accepted as a legal definition from the states, of course. But basically the idea was that rather than having to prove that the victim did not consent, the accused has to prove that he or she, let's face it, it's going to be he, obtained consent. So it actually undermines the entire sort of legal process of innocent until proven guilty.
You have to be able, a man has to be able to prove he got consent.
Affirmatively. Exactly.
How on earth, unless he recorded a conversation or made a video, how is he supposed to?
Hilariously enough, there was actually an app that someone made.
Oh yeah.
Where both parties could put in before the encounter that they consented, and it would serve as a record. And then there was, of course, a huge uproar because people were saying that it was victim blaming or something. I really don't know. I mean, they were saying this is what you wanted, right? You wanted but then they said, oh, but then if something changes during the course of the encounter, they can use the previous written evidence as a way of completely undermining it. Well, then it really just comes back to one person's word against another again. But my concern about this, I have two concerns. The first concern I have is that intoxication is included. And I don't know, I personally don't drink, but we live unambiguously in possibly the biggest drink culture in the world.
We do. It's
and
really
so
sad.
much of the sex that people have is based around getting slaughtered, going to coppers if you're in Dublin. If you're listening from a different city in Ireland, you have your own last chance saloon. And perhaps waking up the next day having no idea what the hell happened and who you're with. And that happens all the time. And presumably under this definition, that would have to be sexual assault or rape, because remember, as happens to many men and women of all ages.
Then could they not? They can't remember giving consent. So
well, yeah, have you been raped then? Like, you know, how's it going to work? I understand if someone's passed out drunk, that's different, but the fact remains that people drink to, you know, Dutch courage. They drink to build up the courage to go out and meet someone and have sex with them.
Yeah, it's maybe you see, there's so much more to it than just the rape that ends up in the social media, or that ends up in the court. If it's that sort of situation, like there's so much wrong with the people who are going out and letting that happen to themselves and calling it fun. Yeah, you know.
I mean, it's kind of absurd. If we take that being drunk means that you can't consent and means you were violated, then unfortunately I would say I know literally dozens of people who are victims by that definition. So yeah, nothing is really improved by including the intoxication clause, because the first thing I would argue is, well, are we going to say that everyone who goes to a nightclub and goes home with someone is victimizing? Are they victimizing each other if they're both drunk? You know what I mean?
I don't know.
It's a bit.
I don't know. I think a big phrase for me these days, as important in every aspect of the world, is self-control. And I think, I don't know, if we could pare it all down to maybe where the problem begins, is if people maybe had a little bit more self-control, then a lot of these conversations wouldn't need to be happening.
Well, you know, that is true. And I've written about this, particularly the problem in universities when they're trying to teach this stuff now, which I'm not against, by the way, as long as it's not mandatory. I'm not against them trying to educate. And in Trinity, they had a campaign. That's where, if people don't know, that's where I'm a student. And their campaign was sort of just a couple of videos showing like do's and don'ts. And for the most part, it was okay. But there was one particular there was no emphasis at any point. It was more what they didn't put in than what they did that was a problem for me. They did not really seem to hammer home that it's your own personal responsibility when you're having sex, that you need to be comfortable, that you know what you want, you know that you can vocalize it, and that you know that you're going to be able to say yes or no. I'm comfortable, I'm not comfortable.
And that you're going to be able to live with that decision tomorrow.
Yes. And if you don't feel able to do that, I don't think you should be getting intimate with anyone. Because even if you're trying to send the most clear cues that you can, there's always going to be room for misinterpretation. There's always going to be room for doubt unless you are able to say exactly what you want or communicate exactly what you want. And there's not enough emphasis being placed on that, in my opinion, to tell people it's not someone else's responsibility to keep checking in with you.
No, exactly.
They should do that, but it's not. At the end of the day, it's your responsibility for yourself to pay attention to what you want and what they want. Most importantly, to be very comfortable externalizing what you want. And that's what I would teach people.
It's a big cultural problem of our generation. I'm 37. You're 25. David, I don't know how old you are. I think maybe.
You never ask a man his age, Sarah.
Well, I can't see him. But you know, it's become a kind of a shortcut to validation. You know, getting laid.
Yeah,
like, you know,
yeah, it is. It's a mark of status, and
it's a mark of status, yeah, or it's a mark of attractiveness to a woman, or you know, and it's it's a mark of achievement or whatever to a man. I don't know, but yeah, it's just it's so wrong. It's so wrong. That's not what sex is for. Do you know what I mean? People going out to score. It's even called scoring.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Just going out to find someone who's just as drunk and just as desperate to validate themselves as you are. And if you guys happen to come across each other in the dark nightclub at the right time, then both of you will be temporarily validated. Both of you will feel awful tomorrow, and one of you might even be pregnant. Well,
that was a very nice soundbite there. I actually think I might cut that one out and make it a single clip for our Facebook page.
Yeah, and I might just need to move from Dublin. but you know what I mean? It's that simple. Like it's a really big problem with a really short description. Like people are validating themselves by having sex with people they don't know and they don't care about, and often that results in more people. And like, then what? You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a crazy idea.
It's crazy.
Yeah, and you know, it's a point worth making. the need to validate yourself, as you say, rather than to have good fun and maybe even show love to somebody, which is far more important. But I just want to go back to something that the point James made earlier, and that was the drive in this whole area of consent. It seems to me it is to shift the onus of responsibility, to shift the burden of proof from the prosecution to the defendant. In this case, it's the man. The man has to prove in a case where there's a charge of rape is being made. The man has to prove that he actually is innocent, that there was consent, and this is a fundamental shift in the law, because it's a basic principle of law that you are innocent until found guilty. And this is happening not just in this area, but I believe it's happening in other areas as well. And it's a frightening prospect.
Well, just to say, we do have some of the best due process, well, in the world here in Ireland, at least. If Rugan McCormick's book about the Supreme Court is to be believed, which I just recently read, we have very good due process rights and a history of judges who uphold the rights of, if you like, the ne'er-do-wells by affirming that they have a right to due process. So I think the new definition doesn't shift that burden, but it certainly, there's some aspects of it I don't particularly agree with, like I mentioned about intoxication, because it just doesn't seem to add any clarity. In fact, it might even define a lot of banal sexual encounters as a crime, which is just crazy to me. But if you look at it, like I said, across the pond, the kind of thing that you would want to avoid at all costs would be for this to be put into, for example, universities. That's a very American phenomenon, but nonetheless, I'm sure a lot of people of activist persuasion of my age in universities think that it's an excellent idea to have universities adjudicating claims of sexual assault on campus, for example, without proper due process. Or also other activist types mooting the possibility of making it a civil claim, having a civil court for this kind of thing, which would, of course, reduce the burden of proof immediately to preponderance of the evidence rather than guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and would reduce the penalties to be essentially compensatory rather than punitive. So that's the kind of thing we need to really be worried about if we're looking at changes to a legal system. It's making it a civil offense, which I personally find that distasteful, the idea that such a serious crime could be considered civil. And
civil,
I would not.
a difference between civil and criminal is you go to jail or you don't go to jail, does it?
Essentially, yes. You have a much higher burden of proof in criminal cases. Mm-hmm. So actually, some context for this is that recently there was a huge scandal in Canada about a man named John Ghomeshi, who was falsely accused by a group of women of being, I think in most cases it was some sort of battery or sexual assault. Of course, he was acquitted because they were shown in court to have been lying. And many people immediately use it as evidence that victims they continue to refer to the false accusers as victims and said that they didn't get their justice. And clearly a new kind of parallel court system is needed to deal with it. And it would be a civil claims court. So that would be a disaster, in my opinion. But we're not looking at anything of that sort here. We're looking at a definition change, the establishment of a definition which has some elements that I would find worrying. And we have a cultural shift, at least as far as young people my age and universities policies are concerned, towards giving out advice about this that, in my opinion, is misleading or not really preparing young people for having sex, basically, because it doesn't actually reiterate that at the end of the day, they're going to be responsible for themselves, especially if they get drunk. They're still going to be having encounters with people they might actually regret. and no amount of legal definition or cultural shifting is going to change that.
Yeah, I think like you said, Ireland is in a really, really, really conspicuously vulnerable place for this sort of kind of topic, because, you know, alcohol and natural tendencies of like a male in a exciting social situation mixed with girls who are not in their state of possession of their normal amount of self-control, however much that personal level of self-control is. Alcohol loosens your self-control.
Absolutely.
So it's crazy. It's, you know, what one sober Marianne would say absolutely no to on a Tuesday afternoon, she might say, oh yeah, why not on a Friday night? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And she might not identify with that drunk Marianne when it gets to Monday again. So it's really dangerous. Like, I think if anybody was looking at us from a culture where there's no alcohol, they'd be shaking their heads, you know?
Yeah.
Because, like, you know, physically, sexual activity is a natural tendency of the male of any mammal species, right? So I think girls need to take more responsibility on to be minders of themselves, because as we get intoxicated and the men in our company get intoxicated, the natural inclination of the male of the species could possibly get stronger. So it would, I would say, be more important that the girl stays more sober rather than gets drunk alongside, because it's kind of her responsibility is growing. You know what I mean? I don't know. I sound very damning with my views of all of this, but like, I don't drink. I used to drink, but I don't drink these days at all. And I'm 37, and I was a student, and I was a person in her 20s, and I can talk about those situations with authority. You know what I mean? I'm not throwing stones from outside. I've been that girl 10, 15 years ago. I know those states of mind that change, and very much change, you know? So, but it just sounds like I'm over reductive on the subject. But, you know, girls need to be assertive, and they need to be more sober. Like, to be going and getting ossified in the company of a man that you don't really know, but like, he made you laugh at the start of the night. What, you know what I mean? It's like, it's just, it's crazy. It's crazy.
Well, I'm not trying to diminish responsibility. Personally, I think, you know, regardless of how drunk or not you are, of course, you still, you know, I would never blame somebody who was pass out drunk for anything that were to happen if they're in the company of some, you know, unsavory individual.
Yeah, but would they have been in that situation if they hadn't got pass out drunk? You know, it's different when somebody's drink gets spiked, but when somebody knowingly and absolutely by their own choosing, like, ingests way over a recommended amount of alcohol for their personal size and frame, they are like, you know, they're blindfolding themselves, they're tying themselves up. Like,
but I would just say, personally, I would clarify to say, I'm talking about situations where, like, you know, people get drunk and they think they're going home with, I don't know, Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, and then they wake up the next morning and it's just like, who the hell is this person? Oh my God, I never would have done this while I was sober. I think that's a completely different set of affairs from, you know, forcible rape.
Oh no, forcible rape is different, but I'm just, in my head, I'm thinking about all this college stuff that's been happening in America in the last year or so, and that's sort of, those are making up big numbers in the amount of assault cases we hear of these days.
Oh yeah, the original Mary Koss study was very leading questions. There was things like, have you ever slept with a man after he gave you alcohol? And that would be interpreted as, you know, someone deliberately got you wasted to nefariously get you into bed, when really it was just, we got drunk and then we had sex.
Yeah,
That kind of thing. There's lots of problems with that, but look, I think we've teased this one out a fair bit. David, have you any
so.
final?
I'm really tired now. I'm kind of
Yeah, sure. I'm wilting as well. So yeah, maybe I think it's a good idea. Maybe if we
Probably a good idea to get into a wrap up now.
Yeah.
So okay, so all that's really left to say is thank you for listening. If you got this far, this was our very first one, so hopefully in future we'll have a little bit more structure and time management and stuff like that. But all that's really left is to point you towards the various ways you can contact us in order to get involved, if you would like, or just to pass comment. You can, of course, subscribe to this YouTube channel, which will be updated with podcasts, footage from our conference, and other clips. You can follow us. You can't follow us on Twitter yet because we haven't got one, but you can come onto our Facebook, Men's Voices Ireland, at Men's Voices, and you can follow, whatever you like on that page. We haven't been updating it so much at the start of the year yet, but we will probably get a regular stream of content going once we get once we have some news and once we get a little bit of our footage from our conference edited and ready to go. Other than that, well, the official email is mensvoicesireland@gmail.com. So if you have any official business with the group, please feel free to email and make inquiries there. And if you would like to contact any of us personally, I would say go onto the Facebook page and go from there, because otherwise we're going to get into a messy situation of people putting their emails out in public, getting spammed and so on. And so, yeah, thank you very much for listening, and we will see you very soon.
Bye.